Millions of loyal fans were devastated when Tucker Carlson first reported Frank Fritz's death. Frank spent years traveling dusty back roads in search of lost treasures and forgotten relics as the co-host of American Pickers, where he became a household name. Frank captivated audiences with his deep knowledge of antiques and his easygoing charm, but behind the scenes, his life was marked by personal battles, declining health, and a friendship that was torn apart. Now, the devastating report surrounding his death exposes a grim reality that fans will have to deal with. His autopsy report is full of sad details that paint a heartbreaking picture of his last days. What was found in Frank Fritz's autopsy report will break your heart. The rise of Frank Fritz, a life dedicated to collecting. Long before he became famous on TV, he was just a kid with an eye for hidden gem. He became interested in things with history early on while other kids played with new toys. Frank searched flea markets, garage sales, and even trash heaps with old artifacts that he wasn't just collecting, he was testing. Every old coin, bottle, or sign that had been forgotten had a story to tell, and Frank was determined to find it. His love of history shaped his whole life and led to a career that made him a famous figure in the world of antiques. As he got older, Frank's interest grew beyond small collectibles. He became interested in motorcycles too, and loved the sleek lines, mechanics, and history behind each machine. He was drawn to it all because he liked how well-made old bikes were. By the time Frank was a teenager, he was already looking through swap meets for rare parts to fix up old models and turn what other people saw as junk into valuable items. He had an uncanny knack for finding value in things that others would have ignored, which would later define his success. Despite his love of collecting, Frank didn't start working in the antiques business right away. After high school, he went to college and got a degree in business administration. He had a stable job as a fire inspector, which required close attention to detail and long hours on the road. But his love of picking things didn't go away. On the weekends and during breaks, he would go to antique shops and auctions to look for one-of-a-kind items. His fire inspections often took him into old buildings, abandoned factories, and businesses that had been closed for a long time, where he would find hidden treasures waiting to be found again. It was during these years that he improved his skills, learned how to negotiate, and grew his knowledge. Frank quickly realized that his true calling wasn't as a firefighter, but as an antiques collector. What started as a side hobby quickly turned into a full-time business when he opened a small shop called Frank's Fins and quickly became famous among collectors. His sharp eye for value and easygoing personality made him a respected figure in the antiques world, and customers trusted his gut. He wasn't just a seller, he was a guide. As a historian, Frank saved pieces of the past, one artifact at a time. But his rise to fame on TV was still ahead. He was clearly passionate about collecting, but what made him stand out was his ability to bring history to life. Unlike most antique dealers who focused on high-end auctions, Frank had a knack for finding value in everyday items that told stories about America's past. His excitement was contagious, and it wasn't long before his name started to become known. Then there was the chance that changed everything. Mike Wolfe, a longtime friend and fellow picker, pitched the idea of a reality show about professional antique hunters. The idea was simple. Two guys would travel across America looking for lost treasures. Frank would be a great co-host because he was knowledgeable, relatable, and full of personality. When the History Channel finally picked up American Pickers in 2010, Frank's world changed overnight as the show took off. He became a fan favorite right away because of his funny personality. People connected with his genuine love for history and his ability to turn lost objects into meaningful finds. But with fame came new pressures, and the road ahead would not always be smooth. The very passion that made him successful would also bring struggles that few could have predicted. Frank had built a life around preserving history, and soon he would have to fight to keep it alive. When American Pickers first aired on the History Channel in 2010, no one thought it would become one of the most popular reality shows on TV. The idea behind the show was simple. Two experienced collectors would travel across the country, digging through barns, garages, and junkyards in search of lost treasures. But what made the show stand out wasn't just the antiques. It was the chemistry between the hosts, Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe. They weren't just business partners, they were lifelong friends with a shared interest in antiques. There was an instant hit with American Pickers because of Frank and Mike's love of history, their friendly rivalries, and their deep knowledge of Americana. Millions of viewers followed them as they traveled across the country to find lost artifacts and meet strange collectors along the way. Their adventures changed the antiques business and made collecting popular with more people. Frank found himself at the center of it all, but fame came with problems. Frank was on the road for months at a time for filming. Long days, unpredictable weather, and hours spent negotiating deals were hard on his body. While it looked like a dream job on screen, it was actually much more exhausting for someone with Crohn's disease. The constant travel and stress made it very hard to manage his condition. On top of his health problems, the weight of fame became too much for him to handle. Fans recognized him everywhere he went, and strangers approached him in stores, restaurants, and even gas stations. At first, Frank welcomed the attention. He was thankful for the support. But as the years went by, the constant attention started to wear him down. He wasn't just a collector anymore, he was a TV star, and that came with expectations he never signed up for. Behind the scenes, the pressure grew, and the friendship that had been at the heart of the show started to show cracks. Frank and Mike had built American Pickers together, but as the show went on, tensions between them grew. There were rumors of fans talked about a falling out between F and Frank's on-screen presence started to fade. Some noticed that he wasn't in as many episodes, while others thought there might be deeper problems going on behind the scenes. Despite the stress, Frank kept doing what he loved, finding and preserving pieces of history. But fame had changed everything. What began as a passion project had become a demanding machine that didn't leave much room for personal struggles. He had spent years looking for forgotten treasures, but in the process, he had lost something. Frank was having problems behind the scenes that no one could see. His health was getting worse, his relationship with Mike was falling apart, and the stress of keeping up his on-screen persona was getting too much to handle. The road ahead would not be easy, and soon the show that made him famous would be the thing that drove him away. Health problems were the battle that defined his later years. Frank Fritz's charm and enthusiasm on American Pickers made him famous, but behind the cameras he was a man who fought a never-ending battle with his own body for years. He had Crohn's disease, an inflammatory bowel disease that caused unpredictable and painful flare-ups. The disease made everyday life hard, but it was even harder for someone who spent long days on the road digging through dusty barns and garages. Crohn's disease is an invisible illness that can make a person look fine one minute and completely disabled the next. Frank rarely talked about his condition on the show, but those close to him knew how hard it was for him to work on American Pickers, which meant long hours, limited access to healthy food, and grueling travel. For someone with Crohn's, managing diet, stress, and physical strain was crucial, but his job made that almost impossible. As the years went by, fans noticed changes in Frank's appearance. Sometimes he looked full of energy, and other times he looked tired and had lost a lot of weight. Some people wondered about his health, but only those closest to him knew how Frank refused to let Crohn's disease define him, but his condition got worse as the stress of filming and keeping up with his busy travel schedule became too much for him to handle. Then he faced another battle that was harder to ignore. As his health problems got worse, Frank turned to alcohol as a way to deal with them. His drinking habits, which had been manageable for years, turned into a full-blown addiction. Eventually, his problems caught up with him, and in 2017, he was arrested for operating while impaired after driving the wrong way on an Iowa interstate. He later admitted that he had been drinking and taking Xan, a medication often used for anxiety. The arrest woke Frank up to the fact that he needed help, and he worked to regain control over his life over the next few years. In 2020, he checked himself into an alcohol rehab facility and stayed there for 77 days, determined to turn his life around. He was honest about his problems and admitted that he had lost control. Frank was focused on making better decisions while he was recovering. Fans admired his honesty, and many hoped that he would return to American Pickers healthier and stronger. But he wasn't on the show for months and years, and rumors about his return grew. The History Channel stayed quiet when Frank finally spoke out about it in 2021. His words shocked fans. He said that he hadn't quit the show, he had just never been asked to return. Mike Wolf's health had gotten worse, and he felt abandoned by both his co-star and the network. He said that Mike never checked in on him while he was recovering and that he was fired from American Pickers without any notice. His departure wasn't just a career loss, it was a personal betrayal. Tensions between Frank and Mike had been building for years, but now it was clear that there was no going back. Frank had given over a decade to the show, and in the end he felt, dumb others, thought that Frank had been unfairly ignored during one of the hardest times in his life, even though he worked hard to get better. Frank's problems didn't end when he left rehab. His health remained unstable, and without the show, he faced new financial and personal problems. His love of collecting never went away, but the world that once praised him seemed to have moved on. By the time Frank had a stroke in 2022, his life had already taken a heartbreaking turn. The man who used to drive treasures was now fighting for his life because of his illness. He couldn't take care of himself, and a court-appointed guardian was put in charge of his finances and medical decisions. His last years weren't the triumphant comeback that many had hoped for. He had fought to reclaim his life, but his body had been through too much. Years of fighting Crohn's disease and personal loss had left him physically and emotionally drained. What was once a story of adventure and discovery had turned into one of pain and isolation. The tragic details can be found in Frank Fritz's autopsy report, which show how much he had been through. In the end, the rift between Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe was a friendship lost for more than a decade. Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe were the heart of American pickers. They had a love of history in common, but their personalities were very different, and they had great chemistry on screen. Fans thought their friendship was as strong off-screen as it seemed on-screen, but tensions had been building for years. When Frank left American Pickers in 2020, it was the first public sign that something was wrong. At first, it seemed like the reason was simple. Frank had back surgery and needed time to recover. But as the months went by without him coming back, rumors of a deeper problem began to spread. Fans noticed that Mike had moved on with the show and rarely mentioned Frank, and new episodes kept airing without his longtime co-host. The silence was deafening until 2021, when Frank finally broke it in an explosive interview. He said that he had not left American Pickers voluntarily, he had been pushed out. He said that after taking time off for surgery, he had expected to get a call telling him to come back, but it never came. According to Frank, Mike had stopped talking to him completely, failing to check on Frank's recovery or give any reason for his absence. Frank's words made it clear that any friendship they may have had was over. "I didn't leave the show. I didn't quit. They never asked me back," he told his son. In 2021, it was clear that he was angry and hurt from being betrayed. He was upset that someone he had worked with for years had fired him so quickly. Mike, on the other hand, had a more polished response. In a statement, he said he was sorry about Frank's departure and wished him the best, but his words lacked the warmth that fans had expected. The fallout shocked longtime viewers because Mike and Frank had been inseparable on screen for years. Now, it was clear that their partnership had ended not only professionally but also personally. While Frank had always been more open about his feelings, Mike stayed away, which led to rumors that he had distanced himself on purpose from his former co-host. Some fans supported Frank, thinking that he had been unfairly thrown out during one of the hardest times in his life. Others thought that Mike had grown tired of Frank's personal problems and saw his absence as a chance to take the show in a new direction. Whatever the truth was, the friendship that had once defined them remained. After American Pickers ended, Frank worked on rebuilding his life outside of the show, but the feeling of loss stayed. He kept saying that he was upset about how things had ended, saying that he had thought of Mike as a brother and never expected to be shut out so coldly. Fans kept hoping for a reconciliation, but the distance between them stayed. When Frank had a stroke in 2022, the reality of their broken friendship became even more painful. Mike finally talked about it in public, asking fans to pray. Many people thought the words were hollow and came too late for Frank's recovery. There were no reports of a heartfelt reunion or signs that their friendship had been fixed. By the time Frank died in 2024, there was no longer any chance for them to get back together. His death left an undeniable void in the world of American Pickers. Mike's touching tribute on social media only made it clear how far apart they had become. The tragic details later found in Frank Fritz's autopsy report would only add to the heartbreak. They would show how much he had been through in the end. Frank's final years of struggles after the spotlight. By 2022, Frank Fritz had already been through a lot. He was dealing with Crohn's disease, addiction, and the painful rift with his longtime friend, Mike Wolfe. But nothing could have prepared him for the terrible event that would change his life forever. On July 14, 2022, Frank had a massive stroke at home in Davenport, Iowa. A close friend found him unresponsive and called for help right away. If he had been alone for much longer, doctors later said he probably would not have survived the severe stroke that left Frank unable to care for himself. His mobility was greatly reduced and his speech was impaired, making simple tasks nearly impossible for a man who had spent years traveling the country in search of forgotten treasures. Frank's sudden loss of independence was devastating, and it didn't take long for the reality of his condition to set in. He would need medical care around the clock for the rest of his life. As news of his stroke spread, fans hoped for far grimmer. Frank's health had already been harmed by years of illness, addiction, and the huge stress that came after he left American Pickers. Now that his body was even weaker, his future looked uncertain. Since Frank couldn't make medical or financial decisions for himself, the court stepped in and appointed a guardian to oversee his care and manage his assets. This was the start of a complicated legal and financial battle for a man who had built a career on finding value in the forgotten. It was a cruel twist of fate that his own life was now being managed by strangers. The situation was dire. Frank had made a lot of money on TV, but the costs of long-term care quickly drained his resources. His medical bills went up, and reports said that his monthly costs exceeded $20,000. Without income from American Pickers or any major business ventures to fall back on, his finances became a growing concern in every part of his life, from his estate to his medical care. Treatments were now in the hands of legal guardians, but those closest to Frank stayed by his side. Friends and family visited as often as they could, but Frank wasn't the lively, wisecracking man they used to know. The stroke had left him a shell of his former self, both physically and emotionally. Some of his longtime friends said the visits were heartbreaking because he had trouble communicating and his once bright personality had faded. Mike Wolfe and Frank eventually got along despite their years of fighting. He knew Frank was having health problems and asked his fans to pray for his recovery on social media, but it wasn't clear if he ever went to see his old friend in person. It's also still not clear if they made up before Frank died. As the months and years went by, Frank's condition kept getting worse. The stroke had taken too much from him. His body could not keep up with it. His movements became more limited. His ability to speak became weaker, and his quality of life decreased. America's back roads was now confined to hospital rooms and rehabilitation centers by late 2024. Those closest to him knew the end was near. His health had gotten so bad that it could not be fixed, and his ability to fight was slipping away. On September 30, 2024, Frank Fritz died at the age of 60. The news shocked fans and devastated those who had followed his rise from a small-town picker to a TV star. The autopsy report that came out confirmed what many people had already thought. Frank Fritz's last years were full of pain and suffering. The sad details in the report painted a grim picture of a man who had fought until the very end but could not escape the damage his life had done him. The news of his death on September 30, 2024 devastated fans who had been following his journey. But the news that came out in the days that followed painted an even worse picture. The autopsy report confirmed what many people had already thought. Frank's last days were filled with unbearable pain. It was a heartbreaking end to a life full of adventure, passion, and struggle. According to the official autopsy report, Frank died from late sequela of cerebral infarction, a medical term for the long-term effects of a previous stroke. In his case, it was the massive stroke he had in 2022 that set him on a slow, painful decline over the course of 2 years. His body slowly shut down because it couldn't recover from the severe neurological damage. He didn't die right away after the stroke, but the damage it did could not be fixed. He went from being active and lively to struggling to do even the most basic tasks. His independence was taken away far too soon. The sad report also listed other things that led to his death, including aortic stenosis, a long-term condition that made it hard for his heart to pump blood. Aortic stenosis is a condition in which the aortic valve gets narrow. This puts a lot of stress on the heart and can cause problems like less blood flow to the brain and other organs over time. This can lead to dizziness, weakness, and even heart failure. For someone who had already had a severe stroke, having aortic stenosis made their condition worse and prevented them from recovering. Doctors who looked at Frank's medical history said that the combination of cerebral infarction and aortic stenosis was a dangerous condition. His brain had already been deprived of oxygen after the stroke, and now his heart was having trouble working right. His health quickly got worse. His body was fighting a battle it could. By the time he went into hospice care in the last few weeks of his life, the outcome was already clear. The autopsy report also gave sad details about Frank's last moments. In his last weeks, his condition had gotten so bad that he needed full-time medical care. Frank was put in hospice care after doctors decided there was nothing else they could do. His once active life had been reduced to a hospital bed. People who knew him well said his last days were hard to see. His longtime friends and family did their best to comfort him, but it was clear that Frank was dying because his body was too weak to recover. One of the saddest things about his last days was how lonely he was, even when he had some company. Even though he had support from close friends and caregivers, the friendship between him and Mike Wolfe never fully healed. There were no grand reunions or final heart-to-heart conversations that could mend the broken friendship that had defined much of Frank's life. Mike had publicly asked for prayers after Frank's stroke, but it's still not clear if the two ever got back in touch privately. In the end, the man who had once been half of one of TV's most beloved duos spent his last days mostly alone with the person who had once been his partner. Frank Fritz's death was tragic, but his life had meaning. He may not be here anymore, but his voice, laughter, and undeniable love for treasure hunting live on in reruns, the collections of those he inspired, and the memories of those who knew him. The tragic details in Frank Fritz's autopsy report showed how much he suffered, but they do not define his legacy. His story is not just one of loss, it's one of a man who spent his life looking for history, and in doing so became a part of it. What is your favorite memory of Frank Fritz? Tell us in the comments, we'd love to hear it. That's all for now, see you in the next video.